Japan's decision to curb exports to South Korea of materials used by semiconductor and display makers is also raising concern even in Japan about damage to the global technology supply chain, as well as Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's carefully nurtured image as a standard bearer of free trade. Now, Chinese and U.S. media have been critical of Tokyo's latest trade restriction as well. Let's get a pulse of the sentiment in Japan, as well as an analysis of the current situation there. Joining me live on the line is Jeff Kingston, Director of Asian Studies at Temple University, Japan in Tokyo. Dr. Kingston, welcome to the program.
Good morning.
Now, first off, how is Prime Minister Abe's imposition of export restrictions being perceived in Japan?
Well, basically, the media here is behind him. They've allowed the government to frame the issue and broadly support the imposition of sanctions. Although I did notice in the Asahi, a more liberal newspaper, that they were sort of questioning the imposition of the sanctions and referred to the WTO and saying that officials here are scrambling to come up with a rationale for their actions. And so that scrambling suggests the Asahi doesn't really buy the national security argument, and so it's sort of a muted criticism. But I think basically most of the media here is calling for more dialogue and thinks that because Abe and Moon haven't had a summit since last October, that perhaps it's time for them to sit down and try to hammer this out.
Right. Indeed. I mean, even at the G20 Osaka, they did not sit down for a bilateral summit. Now, the announcement of such export curb was made right on the heels of the conclusion of the G20, which was, of course, chaired this year by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe himself. Now, G20, of course, is where free trade is promoted and protectionism is argued against. Now, against this backdrop, what sort of a benefit is Japan or Prime Minister Abe looking to gain from this conflict?
Yes, I think a lot of people here are worried about the potential for economic blowback and where will this lead and how disruptive. So, looking at the benefit, I think standing tall against South Korea won't hurt him politically. A recent poll showed that 55% of Japanese back imposing sanctions, and the general perception of South Korea among the Japanese is the worst it's been since they started polling 7 years ago. So I think in general he can expect a positive public response to this, and as we know, the upper house elections are coming in just a couple of weeks.
Now, we've talked about this being perhaps a violation of WTO regulations, whereas Japan has been saying that it is actually in line with the WTO regulation and does not violate that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that here people are probably mindful of the 2010 dispute with China, in which China imposed restrictions on the export of rare earths to Japan, which were disruptive of Japanese production cycles. So I think that the concern here is that the WTO ruled against China for imposing those restrictions, and so that's why I think Abe has pulled the North Korean angle out of his hat. Say, well, it's a national security issue, so this is in line with WTO rules. Be interesting to see whether they have evidence of this, and in the WTO arbitration process, how that will be viewed. But clearly, I think that that's a long-term solution. In the meantime, a lot has to be done. And these export controls are basically Japan will review applications. And so there is a bit of wiggle room there. And hopefully cooler heads will prevail, that this is just a sort of, in baseball we call this chin music, a high, hard fastball up close to the head, and they want to maximize their leverage over Korea by playing this trade card. And this is right out of the playbook of Donald Trump.
Right. Some have said that Abe is just playing the Trumpian card once again. And, South Korea and Japan are both big on baseball, so hopefully they can get around this with a wise solution. But South Korean businesses, together with the government, are seeking for alternatives to the materials in Japan's export restriction list or find some kind of a solution to this problem. Samsung Electronics, J.Y. Lee or Lee Jae-young has flown to Japan. Now, how do you see this row impacting not only the South Korean economy, but also the Japanese economy?
Well, the Korean semiconductors are key to supply chains all over the world, and clearly there will be a disruptive impact on Japan. The companies that export these materials will suffer. The companies that use the semiconductors will suffer. Consumers will probably have to pay higher prices. So I don't think the economic pain will be only felt by South Korean companies. And I think that's why people here are urging the two governments to engage in dialogue to avert what could be a very ugly trade spat.
Right, and this could also negatively impact the regional economy as well, so that's where the concern lies. All right, Jeff Kingston, the Director of Asian Studies at the Temple University, Japan in Tokyo, many thanks for your insights this morning.
Thank you.